Now more of the Midcoast Morning Buzz with Richard and Jim. Radio 9, WCME.
Our guest is Gary Lawless, owner of the Gulf of Maine Bookstore, a long-standing business here. And before we interview Gary is also part of the Maine Poetry Express. They're going to roll into Bath at the Patent-Free Library, host an evening of poetry at 7 o'clock tomorrow night as the fifth stop on the journey of the Maine Poetry Express. It's an initiative of Maine Poet Laureate Wesley McNair, and Gary of Brunswick here, and Sally Wolf Wade of New Harbor will be featured poets. Gary, welcome, my brother. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you.
You old hippie.
Oh, well, they can't see me. They don't know.
Now, Gary, you've had the Gulf of Maine Bookstore. It's its third incarnation, but you've been at this on the Main Street location for some time, in formerly the old McBean's store, correct?
Right. Yeah. Beth Leonard and I started it in 1979 in a building that's no longer there, that was next to the Joshua Chamberlain House. And then we were at Henry and Marty's for about 15 years in the space that's now the restaurant. And then we moved. McBean's was in the space, and then there was a bookstore called It's Academic that came after McBean's, and those guys went bankrupt, sort of the way of the chain bookstore these days, and we bought the space from the bankruptcy court, basically, and moved in. Yeah. So we had, the bookshelves were already there, a lot of books were already there, it was pretty easy.
And those of us that know you, we give credit to Beth, your partner. She is affectionately known as, again, to all of us who know you, as the brains behind Paw.
The brains and the looks, yeah. And she's also, she's a native of Brunswick, so this is her hometown, so she's especially tied to this place.
Fantastic. I just want to remind you, you probably heard of this guy, Richard Blanco.
Richard Blanco, yeah.
Richard Blanco was read at President Barack Obama swearing in, and he gave a poetry reading last night. And Richard's from Bethel. He read last night to a sold-out crowd at Merrill Auditorium, following which the mayor of Portland gave him the key to the city. Now, Blanco grew up as a Cuban exile in New York City and Miami, then moved to Western Maine. He moved up to Bethel. But he read a sold-out performance, Key of the City. What'd you do last night?
Cried. Cried. Yeah. I'm just especially pleased that, first of all, Maine was represented at the inauguration by a gay Cuban New Yorker poet. I mean, this is, it shows how diverse the state is, and what a diverse poetry scene we have here. He's also on the planning board, and how many members of the planning board get to read at the inauguration.
Exactly.
It's a great honor. And I also want to put a little plug for Roxanne Quimby, because she actually paid for all those tickets. Those tickets were given away.
Oh, really?
Free. But Roxanne, through her Quimby Foundation, paid for those tickets, so it was a nice thing for Roxanne to do, I think.
With the economy here in the Midcoast, I mean, it fluctuates, but it's fairly resilient. And I just want to know how, in the cyber age and tablets and everything else, how is it that the Gulf of Maine Bookstore has been such a viable and sustainable hard copy bookseller for so many years? How do you do that? How do you explain that?
Well, there are still a lot of people who just like holding a book and just like having a book and being able to look ahead in the book and look back in the book and have a physical object that they can go to. I think a lot of our customers at this point are either older and stubborn and like books, or they're younger, and kids' books are just not the same on a device. The tactile sense of having a kid's book and looking at the illustrations and chewing on the corners of the book if you want, it's still, those two markets are still pretty viable. It's kind of in between. It's the teenage and early 20s reader who's come to be more used to reading something off a tablet or a device.
Gary, how has your business, as specifically as you can be on this, been affected and been changed by the closing of big bad Borders out at the mall?
In one word, would be positive. But we were never really in direct competition with Borders or with Bookland. We were trying to be a downtown bookstore, and they were trying to be a mall bookstore in a mall next to a large military facility that all of a sudden 7,000 people went away. After, so it probably wasn't the best planning move for a chain to open across from the main gate of a base that was about to close.
Did it have to do with the titles of books that Borders were selling compared to the small press and the local authors that you sell, or the hard-to-find books, or did it have to do with customer service?
Well, both of those things. I mean, we opened at a time when Bookland was the major bookstore here in town, and McBean's was here also, and we opened as well. So there were 3 bookstores on Main Street. At another point, there was the Coffee Dog bookstore. I mean, there have been a number of bookstores around, but it is, yes, harder to be a bookstore these days, and especially harder to be an independent.
But you've been positioned, I think it's fair to say over the years, as an alternative bookstore. And I remember talking to you one day a few months ago, and I got the distinct impression that you were telling me that since the closing of Borders, you've become a bit more of what might be classed as general interest bookstore. And you're taking orders for some books that you might not have taken orders for a year ago, maybe.
Well, this is true. This is true. And we don't mind taking orders for books. And the fact is, with computers and speedy delivery these days, we can get a lot of books overnight or in 2 days, which is pretty much the same speed as Amazon, unless you're getting an ebook that gets instantly loaded into your device. But, in that way, in terms of service, we're as fast as anyone else. We have the same inventory that Amazon has, basically. And probably more than that, because they don't carry a lot of the self-published or small press published books that we like finding for people.
So I recall you told me, this is going back a few months, you got somebody coming in and wanting to order Bill O'Reilly's book. And as I recall, you kind of indicated that might not have happened a year ago. Maybe.
Yeah, people don't associate us necessarily with selling books by Fox News.
Yes.
Necessarily, but we don't censor what people read. So if someone wants to order a book like that, we're fine with ordering it for them. We just don't necessarily promote it as much as Borders would have had a bin of them up front. That bin, though, at Borders, if you wanted your book advertised like that, the publisher actually had to buy the space. Publishers had to pay for NDRACs, had to pay for display space. We've never even been offered money to display books by publishers. It's a whole different scene. It's like the grocery store. You have to pay for the display space on the shelves because there are so many products. There are so many books. There are so many kinds of cereal that publishers are willing to pay for space in larger bookstores. In our bookstore, they could care less, I think.
But I'm just curious, in the days of Bookland, when Bookland was the dominant store, did you ever imagine that the day would come when you would be the sole remaining bookstore operator in a pretty smart, literary-minded town like Brunswick?
We did not imagine that, and we did not wish for that, because we were always friends with Bookland, and Beth and I both worked at Bookland before we opened our store, and we remained friends with the people who were at Bookland, and we wanted them to succeed. And it was nice to be able to send our customers down to Cook's Corner to get a book. If we didn't have a book, we would check to see if Bookland had it. That's not a thing that happened between us and Borders necessarily, but we were glad to send customers to Bookland, because Bookland sent customers to us as well, and there was a nice, friendly exchange there. I mean, it's not a bad thing to have 2 bookstores in a town.
That's just basic retail common sense. In a market with your competitor, it makes more sense to have the person leave your store without an item they either didn't want or wasn't satisfied with, but armed with knowledge. And having worked in retail for many years, I know, guarantee that 100% of the time that customer is going to come back and thank you, and they're going to shop in your store for what they do want. So that makes perfect sense. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the big chains don't see that. It's really cutthroat. Talking briefly about poetry in Maine. Now, we mentioned Richard Blanco and what a shot in the arm he is nationally and also in Maine. What's the poetry scene like in Midcoast, Maine?
I think actually the poetry scene has always, it's always been with us. You can point to the example of Longfellow being at Bowdoin. The poetry scene in Brunswick has been pretty international for a long time, and it continues to thrive. I think there's a whole youth poetry scene that's kind of overlooked by some of us curmudgeonly adults, but there's a pretty lively slam scene. And there's all around the state, there's the Poetry Out Loud competitions in the high schools, and we send really excellent high school reciters of poetry to the national poetry scene. Last year we sent Lulu Hawks, who was one of the finalists. It's just changed a little bit. The people who like Longfellow may not think of hip-hop as poetry, or may not. But when I go into schools, for about a decade and a half, it was really hard to get kids to want to rhyme in high school poetry classes. Now, because of rap and hip-hop, they all want to rhyme really well. And they want beats and rhythms, and it's sort of traditional in a way that they don't see as traditional. They see it as sort of cutting-edge new stuff. But it's Longfellow would be excited that these kids are trying to rhyme, and you can either say that's not poetry, or you can go with it and say this is a good thing. So I find it very lively, and there's a lot of people still. I mean, Richard Bleikamp, 1,200 people, and there was a waiting list. I mean, he filled that room, and I don't think it was just because he was at the inauguration. I think people are hungry for poetry.
We're talking with Gary Lawless. He's the owner of Gulf of Maine Bookstore here on Main Street in Brunswick. What's the future look like for you? I mean, you've got a great sustainable business. You've got a great market here. The market is always increases seasonally when the tourists roll in here, and the town population increases about tenfold. So what's your grasp of book sales in general and the state of poetry here in Maine?
Well, right now book sales are pretty good, but the future is tenuous. Even the publishing business is looking more and more into the e-market, and actually I think authors make more money selling an e-book than they do a hard copy book. So we don't really know how much longer bookstores are going to be viable, but we're also ourselves being less and less viable. We're nearing an age when we should retire from our bookstore. We used to think we'd be able to build up a good bookstore and then sell it when we retired, but now that doesn't look so good.
It's like your home.
It's how can we future into a market that doesn't really want bookstores anymore? So we might just have to disappear at some point.
Yeah.
But our customers plead with us not to disappear.
Yeah. Do you have a website?
We don't have a website.
I'm proud of you.
Yeah, we've been open 34 years and we still don't have a cash register. It's no website. No, we're dinosaurs in that regard.
Yeah.
We have a Facebook page. We have no idea what to do with it. We're just dinosaurs, and that would add. We want to see people. We want people to come in and talk to us. I'd rather have that interaction than that sort of faceless internet thing.
Well, Gary Lawless, thank you for coming in today. It's great to see you after all these years, and I'm sure you'll be seeing my ugly face again up in your bookstore, and our best to Beth
and mine.
Yes,
exactly.
I see both of you there, so that's good. That's good.
Gary Lawless is the owner of the Gulf of Maine Bookstore right here on the Midcoast Morning Buzz and Radio 9 WCME.